Hello and welcome to HolisticCircle Spiritual Conversation. My name is Philipp Kobald. We are reaching out to people who are passionate about spreading light, love, and joy. And I have Mike Daw from England, but I forgot where precisely.
I'm in West Yorkshire, Ilkley, um, so the kind of north of England.
And I'm already very jealous because I can see you still wearing a jacket and I have 30 something out here. So basically, I would love to change with you right now.
Right? Yeah. No. Well, I'm down in the basement anyway, so it's always a bit chilly down here.
My wife has not put my podcast in the basement yet, but she's having one eye on the base.
No. Yeah.
All right. So said just a second ago, I'm so looking forward for having you on my podcast. Thank you so very much for making the time. I know you're rather busy. Um,
Hey, we're all busy, and Philip, thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation, and yeah, no, it's always good to talk about this stuff.
so I'd like first of all to say that you play unknowingly a rather important role in my life. There we go. Whoa. Because I started this podcast out of passion, having these conversations, and I've been introducing myself to a lot of meet and greets, always saying this sentence, not fully understanding my own sentence, that I trying to bring people from different cultures, different backgrounds, academics, therapists, and people with. This is my little presentation I have when I reach out to new guests, and I never fully understood my own mission. I just wanted to enjoy myself, and that's why I did all of it. And then listening to your speech and this wonderful thing that how we met, it opened something in my brain, and I finally got my mission is to be a platform exactly does what I present, to have people from the academia coming, from the practitioners coming, from every which way. I just had two basically CEO trainers, very serious people, big backgrounds, and they're trying to a little bit sneak in some spirituality in heavy CEO train, like real big CEO guys, and they talk about free hearts and stuff, and so it's happening. And I found my mission in the moment I was listening to you, that I want to be this melting pot. I want to bring all these different voices here so everyone can learn from each other. And this is what I want to facilitate. So thank you very much for inspiring me.
Even unwittingly, but no, you're very welcome. It's good to bring, we need to bring people together, especially in these kind of times of really polarization, and we need to realize that we're all in this together, really, and no matter where we're coming from and no matter our views and so on, we just need to, we all need to come together in this kind of time of crisis, really, and transformation, hopefully transformation anyway.
So the regular way to start the podcast is inviting my guest to make a quick self-introduction, because a lot of new people who are not from the academia will now first time hear something about your work. I know a self-introduction, you do so many things, could last an hour, but if you give a couple of minutes to just a little bit show all the different things that you do and your different academia background, and then let's take it from there and dive into.
Sure. Yeah. So, as you say, my name's Mike Daw. I'm a parapsychologist, a research scientist. My main focus is on empirical approaches to spirituality and to things like psychic abilities and experiences, things like telepathy, precognition, and so on. My main focus, well, I have two kind of main research interests, I suppose. One is around diet, so particularly dietary practices like fasting and vegetarianism, and how they influence spirituality and psychic experience. And the other main topic of interest, which is what I presented to the Eunoia Summit, was around theories of consciousness, particularly scientific theories of consciousness. And, the kind of progress or lack of progress that science is making towards understanding what is our mind, effectively. And I'm currently, last year, with my colleague, Professor Chris Rowe from the University of Northampton, where I'm also based, we wrote an essay for the Institute of Noetic Sciences. It was an essay competition. I'm very pleased to say we won first prize in that. And on the back of that, I'm now currently writing a book based on scientific theories of consciousness, and kind of looking for a publisher at the moment. That's kind of where I'm at. So, I will also mention sort of outside the kind of my scientific background, my scientific work, I'm also active in the environmental movements and have been for several decades, actually, with a particular interest, again, in food, really, in reducing meat and dairy consumption, in the fact that the world needs to reduce its meat and dairy consumption if we're to have any kind of future. So that's a kind of snapshot of where I'm at. Like you say, I could obviously talk about myself for hours, but that's hopefully gives your listeners an idea of where I'm coming from, I suppose.
And you may not know my podcast that well, but you just now covered about 70% of my guests. I
Perfect.
had at least one or two or three very strong podcast sessions about with feasting, fasting, so well both ways. How does this apply in culture, and what's the health benefits? So this is one of the subjects that I've been covering, and consciousness. Of course, half the guests here are about advanced consciousness because that's what they do. They are clairvoyant or whatnot, so from different angles. And environmentalist, I had a fantastic woman from America who was cleaning rivers. She made a whole movie that won tons of awards about where the main actor is the river. It's an amazing movie where they all come and clean it, and then there's a love poetry to this Ohio River. So there you go. So this is 70% of my guests. And it's so wonderful to see that now from the academia coming back in from the people who are hands-on or out there, that there's actually science or interest and knowledge, observing it, want to study it, and want to bring it in a more broader context. And I think this is so amazing that this is happening. And I know, because I did not fully understand, that a lot of the big chunk of the people who are watching and listening here today are not from academia and never heard about it, even never knew that there is something, that people like you exist, and don't think that we're all bully and wearing a tin hat.
Well, I have to say, there's not many of us. I mean, it is a bit of a niche field, and some people in the scientific field are extremely skeptical. And I use the word skeptical. Some people are very skeptical in a kind of healthy way. Some people, I think their skepticism verges on the cynicism and the kind of denialism, actually. Some people in the scientific community, that's I won't name any names, but anyway, that's an issue. I think the issue is that it's not stuff like telepathy, precognition, and near-death experiences, reincarnation, and so on, are not looked upon by some as very fringe science and possibly not even scientific. Myself and people like Professor Chris Rowe, other people like Dean Radin, Rupert Sheldrake, who your listeners may have heard of, we are doing what we can, really, to kind of bring that into the mainstream, to build the evidence base, because I think there is quite a strong evidence base, and to kind of break down the barriers, really, because actually I think most scientists probably aren't even aware of the strength of the evidence base, and they kind of rely on gatekeepers, shall we say. So there are some people who kind of do know about the evidence base but still reject it, and they're the ones that are kind of even though they're the minority in my field, they're the ones that seem to get the most airtime, unfortunately.
And that's exactly what I meant with my introduction. This is now my absolute life mission. It's become my life mission to make people like you known to the spiritual community who is not aware yet that this exists, because that's what has become my mission. And that's why I'm so happy you're here. And this starts, and it will start in many other different levels, to just tell the spiritual world that there are people like you out there. And because we've been made fun of for a really long time, as you can imagine. So we are rather also defensive or skeptical, or we've been, when you've been laughed at many times, then you also get in some kind of a contraposition, and that's actually ridiculous. And we have to overcome this as fast as technically possible. Right. Okay. Let's start with the first subject, fasting. I must always say it correctly because there's my English always playing a trick. But I'm very interested in because I'm always going into feasting, is obviously closer to my heart. But on the other hand, fasting is very important in so many cultures. It's been part of our culture, and it's a little bit lost and forgotten. sadly, it's becoming through secularization that people have lost these rituals with religion and all of it. And it's one of the sad elements. And can you give us a quick first introduction? Why is this so healthy? Why we're promoting it? Why are you interested in it? Just get starting somewhere.
Yeah, well, I mean, you made the point. I think almost every religious tradition has, well, I don't know whether that's true. Actually, let's just say a lot of religious traditions have kind of fasting as part of one of their spiritual practices. So it's a very common spiritual practice. So shamanism, which I'm sure your listeners are familiar with what that is, associated with indigenous cultures and probably humanity's oldest spiritual practice. Almost every shamanic community, almost every indigenous community practices fasting as part of their kind of spiritual development, if you like. And, you look at almost every religion. So, in Christianity, Jesus fasted 40 days and 40 nights in preparation for his kind of spiritual teaching. Moses did the same, which of course is shared by Judaism and Christianity. And in Islam, it's one of the 5 pillars of their faith, fasting incredibly important. And so, and in Indian traditions as well, in Hinduism, one author I read sort of said that fasting is a part of every Hindu household. Buddhism, it's kind of less focused on, partly because the Buddha himself, part of his as part of his spiritual journey, he at one point he practiced very extreme fasting, and kind of rejected extreme fasting as a valid spiritual route, and kind of advocated a kind of more moderation, really. But nevertheless, a lot of Buddhist monks, they typically don't eat after noon each day. So they are kind of what we'd probably consider fasting for most of the day, actually. So they kind of only eat in a small window. And as you alluded to, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that fasting can be beneficial for our health. So myself, I practice fasting. I didn't start fasting for any particular spiritual reason. I practice fasting because there's a guy called Michael Mosley, who's TV personality, TV doctor. Unfortunately, he died in kind of unfortunate circumstances a couple of years ago, but he was quite a prominent TV doctor, TV personality, and he investigated fasting for one of his sort of science programs, and and then invented a kind of diet, this sort of 5-2 diet. So the idea of eating what you like on 5 days and then 2 days a week fasting. So that's kind of what I practice, and it's been really beneficial to my health, and it's kind of part of my normal practice now. So there's all these sort of, so that's the kind of, sorry, I probably went on a bit long there, but that's the kind of background of fasting.
I just wanted to let's take it further. My audience is absolutely ready. What do you think are the technicalities for why it helps in the spiritual journey? Can we go further and deeper and see what is your conclusion so far, what have you found, why it helps the spiritual activity to fasten?
I mean, I'm going to have to say I don't know. I mean, the nearest I can, I will, however, say, so the first study I did as part of my PhD doctorate was to interview 7 spiritual stroke psychic practitioners. So I had people like mediums and channelers, and people who could do people who practiced out of body experiences, for example, things like that. And I interviewed them in depth, and they all either practiced fasting or they were vegetarian or vegan. And they talked a lot about purification. So they said that fasting had a kind of purifying element to it. So it was kind of a way of shedding toxins, not just from the body, actually, but also from the mind and from the spirit. And that was part of it. I think the other thing they said was it was a matter of the gut. Clearing the gut also helped that thing. And there's kind of a lot of evidence in parapsychology. So that's the discipline of looking at psychic type stuff, is that if you settle down mental noise, then you're kind of more able to access things like telepathy, recognition, and so on. And that also kind of chimes with people's reports. So if people report a precognitive episode, in other words, they feel like they've seen the future, quite often that happens when they're dreaming through a dream, or perhaps, just when they're just getting off to sleep. So these things of you kind of lower the mental noise, you lower the kind of, not so much the mental noise, but the sort of everyday chatter that we have, the sort of self-reflection, the default mode network, as the neuroscientists call it, the kind of left brain thinking. So in other words, you lower all those down, and there's some suggestion really, or the things that I found in my study that these psychics and spiritual people suggested, was that fasting helped lower that kind of mental chatter, that kind of mental noise. So it might be analogous to that. But I mean, clearly we just don't know. I mean, before I started my work around this area, no one, as far as I can tell, has really looked at this in any depth at all in terms of empirical work. So we really are at the very start of this journey. And part of my studies as well were just to see, well, is there an effect? Does it help with spiritual practice? Does it help with psychic experiences?
And how to measure it.
Well, exactly, because we just don't know. And so that was, my other two studies that I did were really focused around that, really.
I have a lovely story from you, from one of my guests. My viewers know it because I think 7 times already I'm telling the story because it so shook me to the core. And it was a woman, and she's psychic, and she speaks with animals, and she's an animal translator, so to say. And in some moment, she just told me about the fokker and the baby seal, and how they get eaten get eaten, and how those two translate with each other. This moment of being eaten, and it is not like a bad thing. It's like an incorporating, like the baby seal is proud to be eaten by this animal, to become part of their energy, and how this energy translates. So you become what you eat, and the eating becomes part of you. And it was a wonderful part of the podcast. And since that time, I'm really thinking all the time, whatever I take in me, whatever I eat, is actually energetically becoming part of me, and is going to infect my energy. So this purification concept, that makes a lot of sense.
Yes, and that kind of brings us to vegetarianism. And one of the other things in terms of eating meat is that people have said that perhaps eating meat that's kind of intensively farmed, in other words, where the animals have a miserable life, and absolutely, I'm sure most people are aware of how miserable intensive farming can be for the animals. There is a lot of negative energy, and if you would then eat those animals, you're kind of taking in that negative energy, really. It's kind of in keeping with what you're saying. I mean, again, these are just sort of theories about why this might matter in terms of spiritual development, or even in terms of our kind of overall consciousness and well-being, really. I
And I
know I
quoted,
have a friend of mine, and he's also was one of my participants, Graham Nichols. He teaches and lectures on out of body experiences, and he kind of says, he says that even if people aren't really aware, he kind of thinks that people pick this up, and that it's just sort of seeing the kind of meat really, and knowing what it is, it can't do people any good really, even if they're not aware of it.
first of all, I told the story wrong. Of course, it's a baby seal and the orca. God knows what's happening with my brain today to clarify this. But since I got the picture in my head that you really incorporate food, not only the nutritions and the vitamins, but also the energy and spirit within the food, actually it's so logic. I was wondering why I've never understood this before. And then you see some soft drink or some burger with all the stuff coming out, and you think this will now become part of me energetically. Do I align not only how it's made and where it comes from, just the whole fatty little thing, and now I'm making it part of me. Once this picture translates, it becomes it's not easy to get out of the brain.
No, and unfortunately, I think it's kind of a vicious circle I think we've got into in society, is that because a lot of people are eating a lot of rubbish, really, in terms of junk food, that kind of washes down their judgment in many ways. And it means that they kind of eat more junk food, but it also means, I think, it clouds their judgment on everything. And it's, this junk food, high salt and sugar is very addictive. And so I think I think this is part of societal problem, really. I think the kind of food that people eat, sometimes from a very young age, it's not good, really, and it stores up all sorts of other issues.
Now, let's make a bit of transition. Let's move further in this conversation, and in a weird way, to consciousness, because this is a odd little jump, but maybe not at all, because the things seen, unseen, the things we are aware, not aware, how we tricked into things. And I know that you presented wonderfully in this last time we met. You presented different forms of consciousness and the stand of the research, and your last paper is focusing on all of it. And in the end, right in the end, you said that you have theories on your own. So I thought maybe if you'd be so kind, let's jump to the end of a 1 hour presentation and, so to say, work our way backwards. I'd be very keen to ask the obvious question.
Well, I don't really have, I don't have any theories of my own. I think there is enough theories out there. I think, I have my favorites, which I think is what you're alluding to. I think, when I gave the presentation, I made the point that there's this guy, Robert Kuhn, who did this paper. He found over 200 different theories of consciousness. So in other words, over 200 ideas of what our consciousness is and where it comes from and so on, of all sorts of different stripes. So I'm not going to be adding to that. I think we might all have an idea of that as well. My own personal view is that theories of consciousness are, another way of saying consciousness to me is God, actually. I think that I personally believe that there is a sort of universal underpinning consciousness that's kind of the source of all things. And in philosophy, that's known as idealism. And there are a number of sort of scientific, so that's a philosophical idea that consciousness underpins all things. But some of the scientific theories that I presented at the Eunoia Summit and that I wrote about in the essay with my author Chris Rowe are kind of scientific, sort of scientists kind of getting to the same idea, really. This idea that consciousness underpins everything. So one example of that is Don Hoffman. So Don Hoffman is a neuroscientist and I think a cognitive psychologist. And he's got this idea that that reality is, that consciousness is, there are kind of conscious agents that lie outside of space and time. So, we feel like we operate in a kind of physical world, but we operate in 3 dimensions of space. And we seem to operate in a dimension of time as well. And that's kind of what Einstein said. But he said, well, consciousness, he believes, is outside of that. And in fact, that consciousness, these sort of individual conscious agents are in fact what gives rise to the physical world. And not just the physical world, but all aspects of the mental world as well. And that's quite a difficult idea for most people to get their head around. Personally, my own sort of spiritual practice comes from that perspective. There are Advaita Vedanta, the sort of Hindu philosophy, the sort of Eastern philosophy is saying much the same thing, really. And this idea of Maya, in other words, the physical world is essentially an illusion and that consciousness is all that is real. It's kind of getting at the same thing. And there are a number of different consciousness theorists who, again, are coming at the similar sort of idea. There's another 2 theorists called Edward Close and Vernon Knepp, who sort of have a multidimensional view of consciousness. So they say that, we have three dimensions of space, and perhaps we have 3 dimensions of time, they suggest as well. But perhaps there are also many dimensions of consciousness, and that these dimensions, that things can exist in dimensions of consciousness and have no existence at all in space and time. And, that might equate to perhaps our soul. So, they suggest that our soul perhaps is an entity that just exists in dimensions of consciousness, and has no dimensions in space and time, except when it's interacting with ourselves, So the idea being that you and I and everyone has a kind of, as a soul. They don't they do mention the word soul. They're obviously quite uncomfortable with that because it's quite a nebulous concept, but that's the way I'm kind of interpreting that. And the idea is that kind of exists in consciousness, but it has a hook, is kind of tethered to us in space and time as well. So I don't know how well I've explained that, but those are two of my kind of favorite theorists, I suppose, and they kind of align with my kind of spiritual view as well. And in the end, I think they're talking about the same thing.
Yes, and a lot of my clairvoyant people who come here would find this all very familiar, what you said right now, because they are the ones, especially who do astral travel, have out-of-body things, and go into the light of the souls, and they can identify their soul within and above, and they see this as a multidimensional thing. So that's a very common story I hear here on this podcast, where people put this into practicality. But I would like to ask, I'd like to annoy you a bit and to see, what would you say a young boy or woman in his early 20s and starting to be interested in spiritual practices, which is meditation, whatnot, and of course consciousness. What are they doing? Can they expect? What is it good for? Or what would tell such a person being interested in the practical sense? Where is here the guidance? Where is science so far that it can give us guidance, we practitioners, to better understand what we're doing, or at least helping us to know what we should aim for? Are we there already, or we're not there yet?
No, and I mean, far be it from me. So, I mean, I'm, my, I wouldn't regard myself as anywhere developed in terms of my sort of spiritual journey. I mean, I just do what I feel is right. And I sometimes I spend too much time in my kind of left brain kind of intellectual world, I think, and I kind of have quite difficulty in shutting that off. So, for example, I've spent many years trying to have out-of-body experiences without any success whatsoever. I mean, I do meditate, but haven't really had any experiences beyond the sort of physical body. So, I think what you may have been asking in terms of what might we learn from the science, is that right, in terms of the sort of science of consciousness that might?
It's a very open question. It's just so many times people sit and meditate and they want to, they want to raise their consciousness, but they would not even say what it is that they want. They don't want to understand what is their aim, and what they have the feeling they want to raise their consciousness. But what is it there? And so I was wondering if you already can give them a hint what they're actually trying to achieve, if we are there.
Well, I mean, I think that would be only unhelpful, actually. I be honest. I think from everything I've read about spiritual practices, it's far better to go in with zero expectations. And so I actually wonder, although I'm very interested in the science of consciousness, I'm very interested in what the science has to say, I think it might even be deeply unhelpful to spiritual practice. And actually, I twist it around the other way. I mean, it is probably, people experiencing different aspects of consciousness, exotic states of consciousness, say through psychedelics or through spiritual practice. I think we have a lot to learn from people who are doing that. And I think it's probably a lot more helpful to learn from them. And in fact, as I think I might have mentioned to you, this idea actually came through our discussion after the Eunoia Summit. This idea of actually talking to spiritual practitioners and trying to understand from them what perhaps fits in with various proposals that scientists have made about the nature of consciousness, so that we're coming at it in a far more sort of humble way, really. That some of these scientists have come to their theories of consciousness, or have tried to understand their theories of consciousness mathematically. So they're kind of understanding it intellectually and mathematically. And, I know of at least one person actually who believes that mathematics is a kind of key to spiritual development. I mean, there's someone who actually practices, their job is mathematics. So they're kind of in a very much a postdoctoral role, and they work in advanced mathematics, but they think working in mathematically is like working in the mind of God. I know
He's not alone.
Sorry. Yeah, exactly. But I'm not there on that.
We usually talk about frequencies, but it's also very mathematical. It's like a vast chunk of the spiritual practitioners who are very much into frequencies. coming from different sources, but it's all mathematical concepts.
But my understanding is that trying to label these things, it's always inadequate, and we are kind of coming back to the idea of God kind of being ineffable or moving in mysterious ways, and that's kind of all hints. Living in the kind of material world as we do, in the kind of waking state as we are at the moment, is a sort of, can be a bit of a barrier actually to spiritual development. So, having said all that, well, no, I mean, I was just going to say, I've been kind of convinced by the reality of things like psychic experiences, things like telepathy, near-death experiences, reincarnation. I've been convinced by that through the science, because I've had some psychic experiences. I do get some psychic experiences occasionally, instances of telepathy or synchronicities and so on, but they're generally not that profound and they're quite fleeting. So I've been mainly convinced by the science, because that's my approach. But I don't necessarily think it's particularly helpful actually to spiritual development to know too much about this. That's my feeling.
I'm so happy I can disagree with you. This is so great.
Okay, well, I mean,
I agree with you that when you're starting out, the least you know, the better it is. 1,000% on your side. But at the other hand, I think we're just constantly we're constantly trying to build this and so forth. I profit so much from listening to your presentation on a different kind of consciousness. Not that I needed to learn, sort of study it or whatever. When you're constantly trying to build up your consciousness, it helped a lot to listen to you. Not that any great revelation came out of it, or that I, in some moment, I can experience that, what you're talking about. And the other moment, like, that feels about right, that creates something. So I think that we can vastly profit from each other, the practitioners and the theorists, because, just feeling it all the time or is great, but it's just not good enough. So I think there's a great thing both sides can learn from each other.
Yeah, well, you make a good point. And it's, yeah, I just think in terms of the sort of scientific understanding of consciousness, we're kind of here. We're at the very start, really. But yeah, there is clearly value in what, these different perspectives. I expect they all have elements of the truth, perhaps. Maybe not all, but they all have interesting ideas. And like I say, I think there's some value in talking with people like you and people who are kind of spiritual practitioners and trying to take forward the science actually, from people's personal knowing, people's personal experiences. I mean, for example, something I heard a different podcast with a guy called Louis Theroux, who's quite famous in the UK, really, as a sort of journalist. He was interviewing a guy called Brian Johnston, who's sort of one of these Silicon Valley entrepreneurs who is extraordinarily rich. And I must admit, I didn't expect to feel too sympathetic with him, because he's one of these people who wants to extend life. What do you call it? Life extenders. So, he sort of says things like, well, he actually thinks he might not have to die, for example, ever. And I kind of thought I'm not going to have much sympathy with him. But hearing him speak was actually really quite interesting. And the reason why I'm mentioning him at all is because he talked about his experience on psychedelics. He said he experienced reality in 10 dimensions. And I thought, okay, that's kind of interesting in terms of the sort of scientific theories of consciousness that suggest that consciousness may be found in higher dimensions. And it kind of chimes with that. But I said I hadn't had any kind of spiritual experiences at all, but many, many years ago when I was at university, I took some magic mushrooms, some psilocybin, and I do remember feeling actually in that state, I remember feeling reality is definitely more than I think it is. And that was although I can't remember that state because I'm not in it at the moment, but it was a knowing. It very much was a knowing. And I expect that's the kind of thing that you were feeling. And yeah, you're right. I mean, this is kind of a joint path that we're on, I suppose. And I don't know if you've heard of the Galileo Commission. You probably have, actually. This was launched by the Scientific and Medical Network, and the Galileo Commission is all about really trying to push the idea of a sort of post-materialist science. And one of the things that's recommended in that report that was signed and endorsed by lots of different scientists in kind of my type of field was that we do need to learn from spiritual practices and so on, and actually start practicing our science a little bit more with this kind of knowing. And there are different ways of knowing rather than the sort of pure empirical path, if you like. And in fact, if things like the material world does indeed arise from our mental world, does indeed arise from our consciousness, then of course this has an impact when we perform experiments. And that's not just experiments that psychologists do, but that's experiments that anyone does, actually. Other psychologists, maybe even physicists and so on. And that's the kind of learning from quantum physics, actually, is that perhaps observation does change things. And so we seem to affect material reality. And that kind of undermines this whole idea of an objective science, whether it's possible to observe the world out there. We're in here, the world is out there. Well, if everything is one, if you like, if everything is ultimately consciousness, then we are the world. We are the, so I want to say we are the children. That's from that song, that's kind of such an earworm. But, it's very hard to kind of maintain this sort of illusion of an objective science. And we kind of have to embrace that, really, and form a new way of doing science. It doesn't mean we throw the baby out there with the bathwater, all bets are off. There is value in trying to be as objective and neutral as possible and acknowledge bias and so on. But all I'm trying to say, the different approaches, I'm kind of agreeing with you, but in a very long-winded, verbose way.
No, that's why we're here. That's why we have an hour, so we can be long-winded and not necessarily quick, come to a point. And just to a quick reflection, it's been one of the new things that so many of the spiritual community are knowingly, understandingly, or half-understandingly into quantum physics. They seem to be grasping on it. Like, this is every second podcast, quantum physics comes up in some way or the other. It's rather interesting that people hope to find here a quick fix to so many of these problems. And
yeah, although there's a danger in that. That, I mean, even what I said about our observations changing things, I think that is just one interpretation of what's going on. I mean, it is true that once you measure something, it changes something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the measuring or the observing is causing that change. So you have to be kind of quite careful, really. And I think a lot of descriptions of quantum physics, especially in this kind of world, are very loose. And that's why a lot of quantum physicists are like, whoa, get away. So we have to be really cautious about what quantum physics means. But nevertheless, I think it does. I think it's fairly uncontroversial to say that it points to the fact that reality is not like we think it is in our everyday world. What that means and how that should be interpreted is still unresolved. And I think I'm always a little bit allergic or a little bit wary, actually, when non-quantum physicists, and I'm certainly not a quantum physicist, start kind of saying, oh, it means this. And it means that we're all whatever. I think we need to be a lot more cautious about that, actually. And that's part of the building bridges with quantum physicists, actually, and and making sure that they're not completely allergic to any kind of spiritual alignment with quantum physics.
Fun fact, one of my last podcasts was with a studied PhD quantum physicist who turned out to become a sound healer. And it was a wonderful conversation. The only thing she says about quantum physics is yes, and that's it. The entire vision, it's yes, no, whatever. Indeed. It's a yes. And she gave me one amazing picture in the head, because I asked her how sound or frequencies can heal us, if it heals the water in our body, or if it's directly the vibrations work with the organs and stuff. And she thought about it for a moment and said, I actually rather think that the vibrations go in the space in between and go in the space between, because there's a lot of, obviously, on the quantum physics idea, there's a lot of space between the cells and so on. Not that I understand any of it, but it was a very beautiful vision. So yes, that's again another one where science and spiritual practices can profit enormously from each other.
Yes, and I think that's really telling, actually, this idea of the space. I mean, that's ultimately what the word quantum means. It means a small, kind of indivisible thing. But it's well, what is in between that? Well, I mean, it's there's clearly no material. The material, it doesn't make any sense to ask that in terms of the material, physical world, because there is nothing in between. It is a granulation in reality, really, or physical reality. So that's the idea. The whole idea of a spiritual practice, just quietening the mind and just going into sort of nothing. I know one person who I've kind of thanked for kind of a lot of my spiritual practices is Deepak Chopra, and he talks a lot about the gap, the gap between thoughts, and that has resonance as well with quantum physics. So anyway,
I think this is so far going very well. Maybe we don't make the big points. Maybe this is not the big juicy conversation, but it's exactly the conversation that needs to be started building. That we're bringing this first little bit, smelling each other, so to say, when two dogs meet on the street and they going around and smelling a bit and get to know each other. This is the idea, the picture I have in my mind with this podcast so far. But the very last couple of minutes, I'd be very happy if you all can just talk the last few minutes to the subject that we haven't touched enough. I know that you're very much into ecology and going out there and trying to fight for the environment and improvement. So maybe if you would like to end all of this with the messages, a couple of minutes, if you feel like, to talk about what you think should be done and so forth, because you will have 90% of the audience will be in alignment with you, and will be, because my audience is clearly vegetarian. My audience is clearly into trying to bring the world on a higher consciousness and do things. So I'd love to hear just personally what you do, what you engage the last couple of minutes, if you, as a nice ending, present your work, how you improve environment, if this fitting for you.
yeah, of course, like everything, that's quite hard to put into 2 minutes. But as a societal level, as is kind of, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. I mean, that's the kind of most obvious thing, and we need to be doing it yesterday. We need to do it with urgency. That's, as I say, that's kind of so blindingly obvious, really, and is scientifically certain that you can't get more scientifically certain than that, really. So it kind of does pain me that there's still like a debate in many countries and with many people in politics, for example, that perhaps we don't need to do that, or it's not very urgent and all the rest of it. And I think what's going on with our weather, what's going on with our climate is extremely frightening, really, and it's becoming more and more obvious, I think. And I think the psychology of the whole thing is very interesting as well, actually, because I think it's interesting why people are kind of in denial about that, whether they're completely denying the science or whether they're denying the need for the urgency. So that's the first point, really. I mean, my main interest is around food and is around reducing consumption of meat and dairy, which kind of dovetails with my scientific work around the relevance of that to spirituality and to psychic experience. But of course, it has reducing meat and dairy is something we also need to do as a society, as a world, really. I don't know if people know this, but the amount of land in the world that's used for meat and dairy, or to grow the crops for animals for meat and dairy, is equivalent to the area of North and South America combined. So it just takes up a huge amount of land. And as I heard someone say recently, is we need to give the rest of nature a go. I mean, it's just, humanity so much dominates this earth. And that's what's causing such a strain on other species, really. There's been a 70% decline in wild populations since the 1970s. A 70% decline. And I just find that frightening, really. And I also think it just shows how out of balance we are with the rest of the world. And the biggest thing we can do is to help the natural world is to reduce our meat and dairy consumption. It not only has dramatically lower carbon emissions than meat and dairy, but it also has implications for less pollution, less resource use, less water use, better health. It's of course better for the animals, and it's just a kind of win-win-win all around, really. So again, this shouldn't be something that's controversial. However, it's deeply controversial, and I think the reasons for that are also quite interesting. I think when you talk about, as soon as you talk about this with someone, or a lot of people, they often think of sort of family events, things like Christmas. And what do they think of when they think of Christmas? They think of turkey, and they think of meat, and what we have in the UK, pigs in blankets, and things like this. And they think, oh, you're going to take away my Christmas. I think that's the kind of root cause, really, of why there's such a backlash around the idea of reducing meat and dairy, because I think that this is people's associations with joy, really, in terms of food and joy. And I'm a vegan. I don't eat meat and dairy, but I love my food. The transition actually was quite hard. It was hard. It takes a while to get used to, but that's, I think, the kind of message that I would say. Again, I don't know how much it's just that, and I think actually
let me help you out there. Why I asked this question at all in the last couple of minutes, because you don't know me that well, but I have this theory that spirituality is an inward-outwards motion. That's my personal theory. You go, sit book or what you meditate, whatever you do, and it only, to me, creates value. Some people always get very aggressive when I say these things. I get very bad emails, but I keep saying it because I truly believe that once you've done whatever inner work you're doing, it has to be proof of concept brought into the real world. To be a better husband, to be a better father, and to care things and to engage things and to care for some stuff. And is it environment, is it food, or is it just, be a good friend? But I need this proof of concept, and I believe very much in it. And after you've done this for a while and you've engaged on your work, then you go backwards in and try to open another chapter. So I'm a huge advocate to have this proof of concept. And I ask all my guests, everyone, by the end, so are you now a better husband? Are you now, a better father? Are you going and cleaning the river? What are you actually doing with all of this crazy meditation and the gongs and everything? It's all lovely and I like it. But what now is better in your life? And that's why I took this last couple of minutes to jump you right into this huge part of your life, just to also demonstrate to my people that there has to be a balance within thinking and trying to research and doing all the work you do. And then you actually also bring it out there. So you symbolize this inward-outward motion, if I may say so, without knowing you that well.
Yeah, so I do think the interesting thing is that outside of the sort of spiritual community and so on, talking about spirituality, it seems that reducing meat and dairy is, yes, it's really good for the environment. It's good for our physical health. It's good for our mental health. It's good for the animals. But then what the research that I'm doing and the studies I'm doing, it seems to be that it's associated with increased spirituality and increased psychic experiences as well, which I find really kind of interesting. And kind of now whether going vegetarian or vegan makes you more psychic, or whether it's the other way round is the other thing. And this is what a number of people have told me anecdotally, people who are kind of advanced spiritual practitioners, whether they're mediums, or whether they've had a kind of psychic or spiritual awakening. They say that what happened was that the spiritual awakening came first. And then they realized that they either couldn't eat meat, it just didn't agree with them anymore, either physically or spiritually. But they just realized they didn't want to eat meat so much, or, they sought out better welfare things and so on and so forth. So it's kind of, I think what my research is doing is showing that there's a link there. There's certainly, I think it's very early days, and it's only me who's been doing this research. But I think that there's something there. Basically, does seem to be a link. What that means, and is there a kind of causation there anyway, and which direction is it in? I think all these are very open questions. But that's what I hope to do more research in, and hope to kind of develop this field so it becomes a field. Hopefully other people will join me really in terms of that research.
And of course, I hope very much, and I would like to add that I would hope that also maybe becoming a better friend or a better father would reflect back to spirituality and the other way around, because you create a higher consciousness, you want to spread more love or be more aware. And so most probably there are many different fields where this what you focus on food, but I'm sure there are many other fields where I hope that this is the reality. And by the way, I know a couple of people who've been during their journey, crazy going into veganism, and they was very conscious with food for a couple of years. And I thought, all right, that's now their path. And then all of a sudden I meet them and they, again, very consciously from time to time eat a piece of meat. And I was like in shock because they were being so far down the rabbit hole. And I was like, this was, like how you, I mean, I could not even imagine that you would ever touch meat again. And they suggest they've reached this point where they are now very consciously, very specific food and, very well taking care of animals and this and that. They're integrating it again and it might turn around all over again. So there is a process. I believe absolutely that you're on the right track, that there is something going on between food and spirituality and food. So there is clearly a connection, and let's hope that you will get the grants needed to make some serious research, so we all, the whole world actually, could profit from some facts and data that helps us advocate. Thank you so much for this very maybe odd little first podcast talking about everything and nothing. But I hope that the people listening, and I had this feeling that the people who've been going with us here today, they get a little here, they get a little bit there, they get curious, buy maybe one of the books that the people you've mentioned, or read the things that you've been doing, or at least have a fuzzy feeling that there's stuff's going on that's coming their way. And bridging this gap is a slow process, and I thought this is a good way of get the ball rolling. So thank you so very much for making time. Again, I know you're rather busy, but I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
No, it's been a pleasure speaking, Philip. Thanks again for inviting me.